The Galactic Diplomatic Academy had been churning out smooth-talking, handshake-wielding ambassadors for 3,000 years, which was roughly 2,999 years longer than it took most civilizations to realize that diplomacy was just warfare with better table manners. Perched on the crystalline moon of Nexus Prime, the Academy's spires twisted into the cosmos like the galaxy's most pretentious corkscrew, each one dedicated to a different aspect of interspecies relations. There was the Tower of Cultural Sensitivity, the Spire of Economic Mediation, and the Monument to Mutual Understanding, though everyone just called it the place where dreams go to die a bureaucratic death. The Academy's reputation sparkled across 17 star systems, mainly because nothing impressed alien dignitaries quite like a certificate from an institution that charged more per semester than most planets' annual defense budget. Students arrived from every corner of known space, their species ranging from the elegantly tentacled Etherians to the geometrically obsessed Polygon Collective, all united in their burning desire to talk their way out of problems instead of blasting them into component atoms, which made the human sitting in advanced conflict resolution stick out like a supernova in a meditation garden. She occupied the back corner of Lecture Hall Omega 7, a space designed with the acoustic perfection that only came from having sound engineers who possessed 17 different types of hearing organs. The human whose application had simply listed her name as Hey You in 17 different languages, had spent the entire semester approaching diplomatic scenarios with the kind of creative problem-solving that made her professors reach for their emergency anxiety medication, while her classmates crafted elegant solutions involving trade agreements and cultural exchanges. She had a disturbing tendency to cut straight through the diplomatic niceties and point out uncomfortable truths that everyone else was politely ignoring. Professor Valdek, whose species had evolved from apex predators but now preferred strongly worded letters to actual violence, watched her with the kind of fascination typically reserved for dangerous experiments. His four eyes, arranged in a neat square pattern across his elongated skull, tracked her movements as she scribbled notes that, if previous experience was any indication, probably contained observations about the fundamental flaws in whatever peacemaking exercise they were discussing. Today we address the final examination, Valdek announced, his translator rendering his natural subsonic growls into pleasant academic tones. You will have 72 standard hours to craft a comprehensive peace treaty between the hegemony of Keth and the dominion of A collective intake of breath swept through the hall, which was impressive considering that half the students breathed through their skin. The Keth-Rial conflict was legendary even by galactic standards, a war so old that both species had forgotten what they were originally fighting about, but continued the hostilities out of what could charitably be called tradition and more accurately described as cosmic-scale stubbornness. The examination parameters are as follows, Valdek continued, his tone carrying the kind of gravity usually reserved for funeral announcement. You must address the territorial disputes spanning 14 star systems, resolve the religious differences regarding the sacred significance of hydrogen atoms, and somehow reconcile their completely incompatible mating rituals that both species consider fundamental to their cultural identity. One student, a crystalline being whose thoughts created visible light patterns, flickered through several colors that translated roughly to, "Oh, we're all doomed." Another, whose species communicated through controlled electromagnetic pulses, was generating enough static to interfere with nearby electronics. The human, however, was nodding thoughtfully, as if someone had just asked her opinion on lunch options. The Keth believe that combat purifies the soul, Valdek explained, pulling up holographic displays of the two species. The Keth appeared as imposing reptilian humanoids, whose scales changed color based on their aggression level. The Hero consider warfare to be the highest form of artistic expression. The Hero looked like what would happen if someone crossed a praying mantis with a ballet dancer and gave the result delusions of grandeur. Both species have rejected every peace proposal in the past millennium, he continued. Their last diplomatic meeting ended with the conference hall being vaporized, the mediators fleeing for their lives, and a 3-month escalation that wiped out 2 innocent star systems. The human raised her hand. Yes? Valdek asked with the weariness of someone who had learned that human questions rarely led anywhere comfortable. Just to clarify, we're supposed to make them stop fighting. That is the general idea behind a peace treaty. She nodded again, then returned to her notes with the kind of focus that made nearby students unconsciously edge away from her desk. The rest of the lecture covered procedural details, historical precedents and the academic consequences of complete failure, but she seemed absorbed in some internal calculation that required frequent references to what appeared to be combat statistics. As students filed out, chattering nervously in their various languages about research strategies and historical analysis, the human remained seated, staring at her notes with an expression that Valdek had learned to recognize as deeply troubling. "Something on your mind?" he asked, approaching her desk with the careful steps of someone walking through a minefield. She looked up, and her smile contained the kind of cheerful confidence that had historically preceded humanity's most questionable decisions. "Professor, I think I've got this figured out already." "Already?" Valdek's 4 eyes blinked in sequence. "The examination doesn't begin until tomorrow." "Right, but the solution is pretty obvious once you think about it." She gathered her materials with the brisk efficiency of someone who had just solved a simple math problem. "The assignment is to create a peace treaty. But honestly, war is the only option." She walked out, leaving Valdek standing in the empty lecture hall, wondering if he should contact the Academy's crisis management team, or just start updating his resume. Outside, the human paused in the crystalline corridor, surrounded by the soft chiming of the Academy's ambient harmony systems. Other students hurried past, their faces showing various species-appropriate expressions of academic panic. She pulled out her personal communicator and began composing a message to the examination board. "Request for additional presentation time," she typed. "We'll need approximately 30 minutes to explain why perpetual warfare represents the optimal solution to interspecies conflict resolution." The soft chime of her sent message echoed through the corridor, blending seamlessly with the Academy's peace-inducing atmospheric sounds. Somewhere in the distance, Professor Valdek was definitely reaching for his emergency anxiety medication. The examination hall had been designed by architects who clearly believed that nothing said serious academic evaluation quite like making everyone feel insignificant. The ceiling soared overhead in a crystalline dome that displayed real-time footage of peaceful nebulae, while the floor consisted of polished stone from 17 different worlds, arranged in patterns that supposedly promoted harmonious thinking. The examination panel sat behind a curved desk that had been carved from a single piece of fossilized diplomatic treaty, a subtle reminder of the Academy's commitment to turning words into lasting peace. Professor Valdek occupied the center position, flanked by the Academy's most distinguished faculty. To his left sat Dean Huckstar, whose species had achieved galactic recognition for mediating the Great Salt Wars of the Outer Rim. Her crystalline exoskeleton refracted light into soothing patterns that were supposed to calm nervous students, though today the effect seemed more like a disco ball at a funeral. To Valdek's right, perched Ambassador Glix, whose people communicated through controlled pheromone releases and who was currently emitting the chemical equivalent of "this is going to end badly." The human entered with the kind of confidence that suggested she had either solved the unsolvable or completely missed the point. She carried a single datapad and what appeared to be a thermos of coffee, a beverage that the Academy's nutritionists had classified as a liquid stimulant of questionable legality, but had never quite worked up the nerve to ban. "Before we begin," Dean Huckstar announced, her voice creating harmonic overtones that made the air itself seem more diplomatic, "I must note that your request for additional presentation time was unusual. Most students use their full 72 hours for research and treaty composition. Most students probably don't realize that the answer is hiding in plain sight," the human replied, settling into her chair with the casual ease of someone who had never experienced proper academic terror. "The Keth and Ural have been fighting for 1,200 years. Every peace treaty has failed within a decade. The definition of insanity is trying the same thing repeatedly while expecting different results." Ambassador Glix released a pheromone cloud that roughly translated to "oh dear," while his feathered head appendages ruffled in what his species considered deep concern. "So your solution is to abandon diplomacy entirely?" Professor Valdek asked, his 4 eyes focusing on her with the intensity of someone watching a star go supernova. "My solution is to acknowledge reality." She activated her datapad, projecting holographic charts that made the examination panel lean forward despite themselves. "Look at the actual data. The Keth and Ural don't fight because they hate each other. They fight because their entire civilizations are built around the concept of eternal conflict." The first chart showed population statistics spanning the last millennium. During periods of active warfare, both species experience population booms, technological advancement, and cultural renaissance. During the brief peace treaties, they suffer economic collapse, social stagnation, and what their own historians describe as existential end. Dean Huxtar's crystalline surface flickered through several colors before settling on a shade that indicated profound confusion. You're suggesting that war is beneficial for them? I'm suggesting that war is essential for them. The human took a sip of her coffee, apparently oblivious to the way this casual gesture made three distinguished academics flinch. The Keth achieve spiritual purification through combat. Their entire religious system is based on the concept that souls are refined through conflict. Take away their enemy, and you've essentially told them that their path to enlightenment is meaningless. The next chart displayed cultural artifacts and artistic production. The Ural consider warfare to be the highest form of artistic expression. Their greatest poets, musicians, and visual artists all emerge during periods of active conflict. Their most celebrated works are battle hymns, war dances, and sculptures made from enemy weapons. Impose peace, and you've essentially sentenced their entire culture to creative death. Professor Valdek found himself nodding before catching the gesture and forcing himself to stop. But surely there must be a way to redirect these impulses toward peaceful ends. Every previous treaty has tried exactly that approach. The human's tone carried the patient quality of someone explaining basic mathematics to a particularly slow child. The Treaty of Harmonious Coexistence attempted to channel their competitive instincts into sport. Result, they invented new sports specifically designed to cause maximum casualties, and when those were banned, they started a war over who had the better sports equipment. Ambassador Glix was now emitting pheromones that created a small chemical storm around his position, while his translator worked overtime to render his distress into academic language. The Accords of Mutual Prosperity tried economic cooperation, she continued. They ended up competing to see who could build the most destructive trade goods, then started a war when the Ural accused the Keth of using inferior explosive materials in their luxury items. The peace of cultural exchange backfired when they decided that the best way to share their traditions was through ritualized combat exhibitions, which escalated into full-scale warfare when the Keth claimed the Ural were holding back their best techniques. Each example hit the examination panel like a carefully aimed diplomatic missile. The holographic displays showed the same pattern repeating: ambitious peace treaties, initial cooperation, creative reinterpretation of peaceful activities into combat-related endeavors, and inevitable return to open warfare. But this is barbaric, Dean Huxtar protested, her exoskeleton now cycling through colors at a rate that suggested serious processing strain. Surely advanced civilizations should evolve beyond such primitive impulses. The human smile contained enough gentle condescension to power a small diplomatic incident. Advanced according to whose standards? The Keth and Ural aren't humans or Etherians or Polygon Collective members. They're apex predators who achieved sapience without losing their fundamental nature. Asking them to abandon warfare is like asking humans to abandon curiosity, or asking your species to stop refracting light. You're not trying to make peace. You're trying to commit cultural genocide with good intention. The examination hall fell silent except for the soft ambient sounds of the harmony systems, which seemed to be working overtime to compensate for the psychological tension filling the space. Furthermore, she continued, apparently interpreting stunned silence as invitation to elaborate, their current war is actually the most stable geopolitical situation in their sector of space. They have clearly defined battle zones, established rules of engagement, and a mutual understanding that keeps their conflict from spreading to neighboring systems. Every time someone has imposed peace, the resulting power vacuum has led to regional chaos that killed far more people than their tidy little war ever did. Professor Valdek realized he was gripping his desk hard enough to leave claw marks in the fossilized treaty material. Are you seriously arguing that we should encourage warfare? I'm arguing that we should recognize warfare for what it is in this specific case: a successful method of interspecies cooperation that happens to involve weapons. She stood up, projecting a final hologram that showed casualty statistics. Their war has the lowest death rate per capita of any ongoing conflict in galactic history. They've turned violence into a carefully orchestrated dance that satisfies their cultural needs, while minimizing actual harm.
It's probably the most sophisticated form of diplomacy anyone has ever achieved. They just do it with explosives instead of handshakes. The examination panel sat in the kind of silence typically reserved for moments when fundamental assumptions about reality had just been systematically demolished by someone drinking coffee out of a thermos.
Dean Hextar was the first to recover, her crystalline exoskeleton settling into the deep purple that indicated either profound contemplation or complete system failure. "Your argument is theoretically interesting," she managed, her harmonic voice carrying undertones that suggested she was still processing what she had just heard. "But theory without practical application remains merely academic speculation." The human nodded as if she had been expecting exactly this response, which, given her apparent ability to predict academic bureaucracy, she probably had. "That's why I prepared a demonstration." She activated her datapad again, but this time the holographic display showed not charts or statistics, but a real-time feed from the contested border region between Keth and Wirral space. The image flickered with the distinctive interference patterns that indicated active combat zones, and the panel could see the familiar sight of two fleets engaged in what appeared to be a carefully choreographed battle. "This is happening right now," she explained, her tone carrying the casual confidence of someone pointing out interesting cloud formations. "Fleet Commander, the Kikavar of the Keth 3rd Battle Group, and War Artist Zealthara of the Wirral Crimson Wing, are currently engaged in what their respective cultures consider a particularly elegant skirmish." Ambassador Glix released pheromones that roughly translated to "I'm too old for this," while Professor Valdek's four eyes tracked between the display and the human, with the kind of fascination typically reserved for natural disasters. "Now observe what happens when I implement traditional diplomatic intervention." The human typed commands into her pad, and suddenly the holographic display expanded to show communication channels opening between the Academy and both fleets. "I'm transmitting a standard ceasefire proposal, citing humanitarian concerns and offering mediated peace talks." The response was immediate and predictable. Both fleets stopped firing, not at each other, but at the communication relay that had transmitted the message. The elegant dance of interspecies combat transformed into a coordinated assault on what they apparently considered an interruption to their artistic expression. "Fascinating," Dean Hextar murmured, watching as both sides worked together with remarkable efficiency to eliminate the diplomatic interference before returning to their previous battle. They cooperated to reject cooperation. "Now watch what happens when I apply what I call aggressive non-intervention." The human opened new communication channels, but this time her message was different. "I'm informing both commanders that the Academy has analyzed their tactical performance and found it adequate." The effect was electric. Both fleets immediately began intensifying their combat maneuvers, apparently determined to prove that their warfare was considerably better than merely adequate. The battle became more complex, more intricate, and somehow more beautiful as each side strove to demonstrate superior artistic violence. "They're showing off," Professor Valdek observed, his academic instincts overriding his species' natural aversion to conflict. "You've turned them into performers. Better yet, I've made them collaborative performers." The human highlighted specific maneuvers on the display. "Look at how Commander Thikavar is positioning his ships to give War Artist Zealthara optimal angles for her signature spiral attack pattern. And see how she's deliberately using non-lethal weapons in areas where his crew might be vulnerable." The examination panel watched in growing amazement as what had appeared to be violent chaos revealed itself to be an incredibly sophisticated form of cooperative competition. The two fleets weren't trying to destroy each other. They were trying to create the most magnificent battle possible while maintaining an intricate web of mutual consideration that kept actual casualties to an absolute minimum. "This is their diplomacy," the human continued, highlighting communication patterns between the fleet. "They're negotiating territorial boundaries through combat maneuvers, establishing trade route priorities through weapon selection, and even conducting what amounts to cultural exchange through the artistic arrangement of their battle formation." She opened another display showing historical data. Over the past year, this particular conflict zone has seen 17 battles that resulted in 0 deaths, 43 minor injuries, and the establishment of 3 new trade agreements. Compare that to the peaceful commerce accord signed in the neutral zone last month, which led to 2 assassination attempts, 1 minor genocide, and the complete economic collapse of a star system. Ambassador Glix had stopped releasing distress pheromones and was now emitting scents that translated roughly to "this is either brilliant or insane, and I'm no longer sure there's a difference." But surely, Dean Hextar protested, though her crystalline surface was now displaying patterns that indicated grudging fascination. There must be some way to achieve these same results without the appearance of violence. The human pulled up footage from previous peace initiatives. The Kethural Cultural Festival of 2387 was designed to channel their competitive instincts into artistic performance. The result was what historians now call the Great Pie War, which started when the Keth accused the Ural of using metaphorically violent imagery in their interpretive dance about grain harvest. The Joint Scientific Research Initiative of 2394 was supposed to unite them in the pursuit of knowledge. They ended up competing to see who could invent the most creatively destructive research equipment, culminating in the creation of a doomsday device that they then fought over the naming rights for. The Interspecies Sports League of 2401 lasted exactly 6 months before they invented a new sport called competitive extinction that required the complete annihilation of at least one solar system per game. Each example drove home the same point. Every attempt to redirect Keth and Ural aggression into peaceful channels had resulted in them finding increasingly creative ways to turn peace into warfare, usually with far more devastating consequences than their original conflict had ever produced. The current arrangement works because it acknowledges their nature instead of fighting against it. The human explained, returning to the real-time battle display. They get to maintain their cultural identities, express their fundamental drives, and engage in meaningful competition. The galaxy gets a stable, contained conflict that doesn't expand beyond established boundaries. Everyone wins, assuming you can get past the philosophical hang-up about weapons being involved. Professor Valdek found himself staring at the display with the kind of concentrated attention usually reserved for revolutionary discovery. "You're suggesting that what we've been calling a war is actually a form of interspecies cooperation so sophisticated that we've been completely unable to recognize it. I'm suggesting that sometimes the most successful diplomacy looks nothing like what diplomats expect it to look like." The human finished her coffee and set the thermos down with the kind of finality that indicated her presentation was complete. The assignment was to create a peace treaty. "I've just shown you that the most effective peace treaty between the Keth and Ural is the one they wrote themselves using battleship formations and carefully calibrated weapon yield." The holographic display continued showing the ongoing battle, but now the examination panel could see it for what it truly was. Not a failure of diplomacy, but perhaps its highest evolution. Two species who could have destroyed each other centuries ago, instead choosing to engage in an elaborate ongoing performance that satisfied their deepest cultural needs, while maintaining genuine respect for each other's survival. Dean Hextar's exoskeleton had settled into a color that indicated either deep admiration or complete mental breakdown. "This is the most disturbing thing I've ever heard," she said slowly, "and I'm beginning to suspect it might also be the most brilliant." The examination hall's harmony systems had given up trying to maintain atmospheric peace, and had switched to what could only be described as existential crisis management mode. The ambient lighting cycled through calming hues while soft chimes played melodies specifically designed to prevent complete psychological breakdown, though their effectiveness was questionable given that 3 of the galaxy's most distinguished diplomatic minds were currently staring into the void of their own assumption. Professor Valdek was the first to speak, his voice carrying the hollow quality of someone whose worldview had just been systematically demolished and rebuilt using entirely different architectural principles. "In 30 years of teaching diplomatic theory, I have never encountered a student who solved an assignment by proving that the assignment itself was fundamentally flawed." The human shrugged with the kind of casual indifference that suggested she hadn't just revolutionized galactic peacekeeping theory. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to realize it isn't actually a problem. Ambassador Glix had stopped releasing pheromones entirely, which in his species indicated either deep meditation or complete neural shutdown. When he finally spoke, his translator rendered his chemical communications with unusual precision. "According to our academic protocols, we should award you a failing grade for refusing to complete the assigned task. However, according to our academic integrity standards, we should award you the highest honors for demonstrating that the assigned task was impossible and explaining why." Dean Hextar's crystalline surface had settled into a pattern that resembled fractured light, beautiful but somehow suggesting that something fundamental had been broken and reassembled into an entirely new configuration. The implications of your presentation extend far beyond this examination, she said slowly. If your analysis is correct, then approximately 60% of our current diplomatic interventions are not only ineffective, but actively harmful. 73%, the human corrected helpfully. I ran the numbers during lunch break. The casual nature of this revelation caused Professor Valdek to grip his desk so hard that small cracks appeared in the fossilized treaty material. You calculated the failure rate of galactic diplomacy during lunch? The cafeteria has excellent coffee and math relaxes me. She gathered her materials with the same brisk efficiency she had displayed throughout the entire surreal experience. Plus, once you understand that different species might have completely different definitions of peace, cooperation and success, the pattern becomes pretty obvious. Ambassador Glix's translator began emitting error codes, as his pheromone releases became too complex for standard diplomatic language. Dean Hextar had to interpret. He's asking whether your approach could be applied to other seemingly intractable conflicts. Oh, definitely. The human's enthusiasm was genuinely terrifying in its implications. The crystalline sovereignty and the gas giant collective have been locked in what everyone calls a territorial dispute for 2 centuries. But if you actually look at their behavior patterns, they're engaged in the galaxy's most elaborate courtship ritual. They're not fighting over space, they're flirting. The examination panel absorbed this information with the kind of stunned silence typically reserved for natural disaster. The Hive Worlds Federation and the Individual Rights Alliance aren't having an ideological conflict, she continued cheerfully. They're having a philosophical debate about the nature of consciousness, and they're conducting it through economic warfare because those are the only terms both sides can understand. If you tried to force them to stop, you'd interrupt the most important conversation about sentient rights in galactic history. Professor Valdek realized he was developing the kind of headache that usually required medical intervention. Are you suggesting that every major conflict in known space is actually a form of functional cooperation that we've been misinterpreting? Not every conflict. Some wars really are just wars. The human paused at the door, apparently oblivious to the way this casual clarification made 3 distinguished academics flinch in unison. But yeah, most of the ones that the Academy has been trying to resolve for decades are probably examples of successful interspecies interaction that just don't look like what we expect diplomacy to look like. She left, and the examination hall fell into the kind of silence that indicated 3 very intelligent beings were simultaneously reconsidering every assumption they had ever made about their chosen profession. Dean Hextar was the first to speak. We need to contact the Galactic Peace Council immediately to report a revolutionary breakthrough in diplomatic theory. Ambassador Glix asked, his pheromones finally stabilizing into something resembling cautious optimism. To warn them that a first-year student just made their entire organization obsolete, Professor Valdek replied grimly. 3 days later, the human found herself in the Academy's most prestigious conference room, facing not just her examination panel, but representatives from every major diplomatic institution in known space. The holographic displays showed her analysis being implemented across 17 different conflict zones, with results that ranged from surprisingly effective to we can't believe this actually worked. The Keth-Ural conflict had been officially reclassified from ongoing territorial dispute to successful interspecies cultural exchange program. The casualty rates had dropped to 0, the artistic quality of their battles had improved dramatically, and both species had begun offering guided tours of their combat zones to curious diplomats from other civilizations. The Galactic Peace Council has voted to offer you a position as senior consultant for unconventional diplomatic solutions, Dean Hextar announced, her exoskeleton displaying colors that indicated either profound respect or complete surrender to the inevitable. The salary includes hazard pay, Professor Valdek added, though at this point I think the real hazard is to our preconceptions about reality. The human considered the offer with the same thoughtful expression she had worn throughout the entire ordeal. Do I get to keep my coffee privilege? Unlimited coffee, Ambassador Glix confirmed, releasing pheromones that translated to please don't leave us alone with the implications of what you've discovered.
and I can work on other impossible diplomatic situations. We're beginning to suspect that impossible might just mean requires a human to point out what everyone else is missing. The human smiled and accepted the position, apparently unaware that she had just become the galaxy's first professional war peace translator, responsible for helping civilizations understand when their conflicts were actually their greatest success. 6 months later, the Academy had to add an entire new wing dedicated to human-style problem-solving, which consisted mostly of a very large coffee machine and a sign reading, "Sometimes the solution is to realize there isn't a problem." The wing was, according to all available metrics, the most successful addition to the curriculum in the Academy's 3,000-year history, though it had also caused the Academy's philosophy department to be placed on permanent medical leave. And somewhere in the contested border zone between Keth and Ural space, two fleets continued their elegant dance of competitive cooperation, blissfully unaware that they had become the galaxy's most successful example of what happened when someone stopped trying to fix what wasn't actually broken. The Academy's harmony systems had been permanently recalibrated to accommodate the presence of humans, which mostly involved giving up any pretense of maintaining atmospheric peace, and just playing very loud music to mask the sound of fundamental assumptions being systematically demolished. It was, everyone agreed, a small price to pay for revolutionary breakthroughs in galactic diplomacy, even if those breakthroughs mostly consisted of learning when not to be diplomatic at all.